The quest for power in the Warcraft universe manifests itself in various ways, from the insatiable thirst for magic to the rage-driven destruction of the weak. Yet, in the conundrum of events, we find ourselves particularly interested in what is perceived as the downfall of an idealistic prince. But contrary to popular practice, I would not leave his story with such an assessment, reducing everything to the question of power and its corrupting effects, and would rather treat the unfolding events as a logical result of the combination of aspects that make him a unique character. After all, we should remember that we're talking about early 2000s Blizzard, a company far more interested in the depth of their games than the one we know today. Through Arthas' saga, we traverse a path from an idyllic fairy tale where a young crown prince embarks on a heroic struggle against the evil consuming the kingdom, to a profound downfall born from the inability to reconcile the pure ideals that guide the vengeful spirit of this hyper-privileged individual with the empirical reality that starkly contrasts with the conditions in which he was shaped as a person. However, it is not only he who falters before this challenge, but also the chivalric order to which he belongs, as well as all the old ossified institutions at the Alliance's disposal. This idea is anything but naive. On the contrary, it delves into a profound tragedy where apparent virtues, but essentially minor flaws, present at the beginning of the story, evolve into their extreme forms in later stages. These flaws, nurtured by misguided actions, often in situations where it is impossible to discern the right course, haunt the protagonist like phantoms, shaping and ultimately determining his future. Such developments continue until the situation spirals completely out of control, causing the entire societal structure to collapse into an abyss along with its leaders. We get a vivid illustration of the aforementioned in Arthas' interaction with Frostmourne, a cursed sword that ends up governing his thoughts and decisions through whispers, leading the kingdom to ruin. That doesn't mean that Arthas loses his self. On the contrary, in the Undead campaign we see him return as the protagonist, but with an entirely altered system of values and goals. This transformation is symbolically reflected in his new role as Death Knight, culminating in the title of the Lich King. Therefore, it is my belief that any discussion about his character must highlight three key themes. First, the idealistic worldview of the Paladin Order. Second, the necessity of action by those in power. And third, the motivation that drives action. It is the intersection of these three that ultimately causes the downfall in the human campaign. Having said that, we should proceed step by step, clarifying everything previously mentioned by reflecting on the content of the campaign in which the young prince takes center stage. We first see him as direct, witty and eager to help the weak, guided by pure ideals, confident and craving validation. Inspired by the light, Arthas wholeheartedly aids his subjects on his way to Stratholme, restoring order and hope. Our hero at first glance seems like a perfect union of secular and spiritual authority, symbolized by the combination of his title as prince and his membership in the Order of the Paladins of the Light. However, the heir to the throne has another side to his personality, which we soon come to know. Upon witnessing that the orcs who had raided Stratholme and ritually sacrificed prisoners to demonic deities are not willing to negotiate, Arthas succumbs to his impulsiveness. He suggests a swift attack and the annihilation of the enemy, but is pacified by Uther's fatherly advice.
Remember, Arthas, we are paladins. Vengeance cannot be a part of what we must do. If we allow our passions to turn to bloodlust, we will become as vile as the orcs.
This seemingly insignificant comment, however, reveals a lot. Founded on a clear concept, dualities that leave no room for nuances despite all the talk about noble motives, the Order of Paladins must, by necessity, be an organization that fosters extremism. By equating themselves with the light and insisting that they represent its protectors and promoters, they can only view their adversaries as darkness or a plague, a scourge. This inevitably influences Arthas, for whom we see in literary adaptations of his story a willingness to equate orcs with rats in response to Jaina's distress upon seeing these creatures in captivity. However, one might argue that Uther is, after all, advocating restraint, but I believe such an objection would be misdirected. For what Uther warns against is the danger of succumbing to vengeful wrath, of letting emotions flare to their extremes, which certainly influences Arthas' downfall later. Yet the problem does not lie there, but in the very teachings itself. If the principle is that the orcs are the enemies of the light and therefore vile creatures, the question is only how consistent and dedicated a follower of the principle is. If we truly care about the victory of light over darkness, we must do everything to exterminate the other side, to cleanse the filth, to fight consistently for what we believe in. This then leads us to the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who argues that being completely consistent in one's beliefs is akin to being fanatical, while inconsistency allows for tolerance. If someone is absolutely convinced that their views are the only truth, they cannot genuinely tolerate differing opinions. He asks, how can morality and social values persist if false and potentially harmful views are allowed to spread freely? Because of that, it would be right to challenge the idea of foregoing necessary actions to achieve just ends if one believes their views are unquestionably right. It may seem trivial, but I believe it is essential to remember that we tend to think in pure categories, which undoubtedly save mental energy and facilitate communication. However, when these categories move beyond the realm of communication and translate into actions, especially in areas of power, their content becomes something entirely different. After witnessing the disastrous outcomes that stem from this, we often hear clumsy insistence that someone deviated, betrayed, or that it was not the real thing, instead of accepting the fact that our interpretation of reality, especially in issuing judgments about it, is inherently and dramatically limited. This should also be applied to the interpretation of Arthas's actions. Instead of insisting on the idea that his downfall comes from abandoning ideals, we should speak about it as a logical conclusion of his stubborn adherence to Puritanism. Thought to think in pure categories and equate himself with the light, however he defined it, and pressed by time and the necessity of decision-making, Arthas consistently pursues his goal, expelling the darkness. Translated into the interactions among factions we encounter in the game, the defenders of the light, that is the troops under Arthas's command, must consistently exterminate the presumed supporters of dark, orcs, undead, and even their own contaminated brethren. Only through this lens, it seems to me, can we interpret this part of the story. Now, if we return to Lordaeron, we can say that Uther and Arthas embody two approaches to the same problem within this kingdom, with, in principle, the same goal. The darkness must be eradicated. The question is merely how we define the darkness and how we plan to achieve that. In the end, both fail. This does not mean that they should be equated, far from it, but it should not be surprising that the alliance Jaina forms with Thrall rises miles away from Lordaeron in an entirely different world. This is symbolically significant because it suggests that even if Uther had prevailed, an alliance with the orcs would have been impossible, nor would he have abandoned Lordaeron. We, as external observers, see that there can be no victory without the unification of races and exodus to Kalimdor. Therefore, it is clear that the only possible outcome, even in a scenario where Uther wins, would have been the fall of the kingdom, only this time it would be marked as an honorable fall. In order to understand this, we must also introduce the prophet into the story, as the harbinger of the impending shadow. Saying prophet in the context of Warcraft is akin to saying stranger, which represents an exceptionally important archetypical motif. Talking about this archetype, Jordan Peterson states that the arrival of a stranger threatens the stability of a kingdom because the stranger's unpredictability challenges the group's established beliefs and social order. The stranger's different moral traditions and actions disrupt the group's sense of security and meaning, making him indistinguishable from the unknown and potentially dangerous. This threat is especially profound when the stranger's beliefs conflict with key concepts of the group's historically determined beliefs, causing existential uncertainty and instability. From the very first scene, we learn that the arrival of the prophet is inseparably linked to the transformation of the environment, signified by the advent of the plague. Step by step, we see all the threats to the existing order. The prophet is also a raven, effortlessly soaring over mountain ranges. He travels swiftly, regardless of obstacles, capable of delivering his message to every corner of the kingdom in a short time. He lands in the royal palace, disregarding the norms of interactions with the king and other dignitaries. He does not wait for his turn to speak and addresses everyone from the central spot in the room, even mildly resisting the guards to ensure his vision is fully expressed. He is not bound by the frameworks of social hierarchy, thus behaving unpredictably. The very fact that he appeared behind the back of the guards testifies to the potential danger to the king as the embodiment of order. He bears a warning and message that challenges the basic understanding of reality, potentially sowing seeds of existential horror and the disintegration of the meaning that has so far underpinned behavior. This message is incomprehensible within the existing order of knowledge, values, assumptions about reality and rules of conduct. Therefore, to most observers, it cannot seem like anything more serious than the random ramblings of a mad individual, rendering them blind to the nature of the challenge they face. But the most interesting thing here is the choice of people to whom the prophet delivers his message. In both the game and the book dedicated to Arthas, the stranger does not only approach the king, but also the prince, the wizard Antonidas, and Jaina. Yet he skips Uther. Let us try to decipher the logic behind this decision. Although interpretations on forums primarily attribute this to the limited time Blizzard had, I believe that the consistency shown in the literary treatment of the theme suggests something else. My assumption is that the choice is neither forced nor random, but rather illustrates the relationship between the representatives of two pairs who are manifestations of realization and potential in two distinct social fields. One of these pairs relates to the field of politics and power, namely the realized state, or what it currently is, symbolized by the king, and the potential state, or what it could be, symbolized by Arthas. The other pair symbolizes the academic field, or the world of institutionalized science, similarly in its realized form, symbolized by Antonidas, and its potential form, embodied by Jaina. I would argue that the meaning of this lies in the following. Within both fields, realization portrays the elderly, symbolically depicting both the positive aspects of longevity, achievement, matured order, stability, and tradition, as well as the inevitable weakening, rigidity, and closure of institutions, whether due to bureaucratization and corruption, or decades-long selection of like-minded individuals and development of what we could call the scientific identity, as opposed to engaging in true, challenging, and stressful scientific work. The danger of such developments is always present, and the majesty of past undertakings present in the character of the king as well as the wizard does not remove the threat of gradual decadence. However, both types of institutions inherently remain interested in the unknown. The question is only how capable they are of recognizing manifestations of the unknown as relevant and dealing with them adequately. This is precisely where their potentials come into play, actors who are yet to assert themselves. They are young, spirited, and eager to prove themselves, encapsulating both creative and destructive aspects of potential. Yet these actors are divided by a fundamental difference. Through Jaina's actions and comments other actors provide in regards to her nature and past, we learn that she is naturally curious. Her free movement and eavesdropping during the prophet's interaction with Antonidas and Arthas demonstrate both curiosity and the fact that she gathers information from both systems, scientific, educational, and political, and observes in symbolical terms the point of contact between the unknown and the known. She is capable of sensing the prophet's power, thereby attesting that she has acquired formal education and practice within illustrious institutions and orders symbolized by the Kirin Tor and Dalaran, but also considers the consequences that would arise if the prophet's words are true, confirming that the institution's constraints have not limited her to what we would call acceptable knowledge. Equally significant is the fact that she is the daughter of the ruler of the kingdom of Kul-Tiras, more than familiar with the world of politics and sovereignty. She is the result of a creative union of order and investigative curiosity, an actor striving to uncover the truth. Unlike Jaina, Arthas, undoubtedly brave and ambitious, represents a union of order and fixed beliefs, namely the teachings of the Knights of the Silver Hand. Enclosed within his duties and prejudice, Arthas remains blind to the significance of the physical manifestation of the unknown and the nature of the problems he faces. Therefore, he is an actor who believes he knows what the truth is, and although all of this can be interpreted as a view of the role of science and state in progress and community survival, we could use this fact to explain why the prophet does not approach Uther. Because what would be the point when we know that Uther is the embodiment of the religious principles of the Church of the Holy Light and the supreme leader of the Paladin Order as its military branch responsible for enforcing its laws? Despite all his virtues, he remains stuck in a rigid perception of reality and duty, just like his disciple. However, it is not Uther who creates ruin with his actions, although, as we said, the result of his approach would also be the fall of the kingdom. He is still a reactive subject, unlike the prince who is actively involved in creating evil. What, then, separates these two? Certainly years and experience, but also the fact that Uther is in the service of the light and authority, while Arthas is authority itself. Not only does his young soul hold on to the principles of the knightly order to which he belongs, still untroubled by doubts and perplexities regarding the sacred mission and his own role in it, or the cynicism leading to inconsistencies, but he also feels the additional burden to take action to resolve the difficult situation facing his kingdom. Returning to Uther's advice regarding Arthas's desire to immediately strike the orcs who devastated the population of Stranbrad, we can say that this is the first point where we delve deeper into the dynamics of their relationship. Uther serves as a source of lessons or warnings meant to guide Arthas in decision-making, akin to a perennial handbook tied to the teachings of the Paladin Order. The fact that he has the freedom to declaim wisdoms without the obligation to supplement it with practical solutions might create an impression of him being a voice of reason or a guardian angel on the shoulder, serving as a corrective factor. However, such an interpretation misses the essence, and this becomes more apparent as the story progresses, leading us to different, complex questions. What can be done when faced with a problem neither has experience with? What advice to give when a schema of encouragements, terms, teachings, and arguments that make up a worldview conflicts with a radically altered reality? How to behave when conflicting visions arise among loved ones? Such challenges gradually yield their bitter fruits, and while initially idyllic, the interaction between teacher and student becomes increasingly strained due to the complication of the kingdom situation, eventually becoming openly hostile before the walls of Stratholm. In this regard, we can highlight the sequence of Stranbrad, Hardclan, Stratholm, which clearly shows that Uther's approach to the problem, as well as the wisdom he offers, is increasingly ineffective in collision with intolerable reality, culminating in the most recognizable mission, namely the massacre of Stratholm's population. The cult status that this chapter has is well earned, not only because of the dramatic nature of the situation and the gloominess of the atmosphere, but precisely because at this point we encounter the essence of the difference between Arthas and Uther, as we discussed earlier, reflected in the following question. Can a paladin be pragmatic? What separates the two protagonists is the fact that Uther does not face the burden of making decisions with far-reaching consequences and the lack of time for contemplation, unlike Arthas, which in itself is related to the nature of human expectations of authority, state, order, system, however it may be called. Because regardless of the catastrophic or moral unacceptability of the situation, a significant number of people will not react negatively or recognize the problem, at least for a while adhering to the idea that what they see or hear is part of a plan, a controlled experiment, state reason, or something similar. However, there is a significant probability that the same people will react negatively in case that the lack of action by the authorities leaves them to the vagueness or haziness of the situation for a long time, without a clearer compass for action and without the possibility to reduce the complex situation to clear and often binary categories. This is precisely what I see as the reason for the prophet's decision to approach Arthas, but not Uther. However, as the game shows us, a plan or state reason also has its ominous side, so Arthas, having previously discarded the prophet's warnings, decides at this point to exterminate the infected population to prevent further spread of the plague. The moral unacceptability of such a decision leads Uther to refuse the command, which is why he is expelled. Arthas, judging by the logic of Leszek Kulakowski, is a consistent actor. Jaina also goes with him since she is unwilling to watch Arthas carry out the plan. This segment is therefore often seen as a choice between a practical solution and a clear conscience, although this is not the only dilemma. Having shown the difference between the heroes of the human campaign and somewhat explained the idea that Jaina rather than Uther is the immediate antithesis to Artus, we can shift our attention to an additional level of interpretation, the so-called problem of conjecture. Like any complex phenomenon, this can be observed on multiple levels, but for the sake of our argument, we will turn to Henry Kissinger. As Niall Ferguson states, Kissinger believed that in situations where the stakes are high, decisions must be made before all facts are gathered. His idea is that the choice between policies does not reside in the facts, but in their interpretation. It involved a moral assessment, an estimate which depended for its validity on a conception of goals as much as on an understanding of the available material. Even if we allow for the idea that gathering all facts is possible or even useful, we must acknowledge that rulers are often faced with the problem of the cost of prevention without the confirmation or recognition that should result from it. Imagine if France, the United Kingdom, or the Soviet Union had struck Germany in 1938 immediately after the annexation of the Sudetenland. Regardless of whether we are talking about the immediate cost for democratically elected governments or the long-term cost of spontaneous or constructed perception of a state's role in major historical events, the burden of starting wider conflict would not be accompanied by applauses and gratitude for preventing World War II. How could we expect such a thing when the war, as we know it, would not have happened the way it did in our timeline? However, the crux of the problem lies in the fact that inaction also produces results. Therefore, it could be argued that action is necessary, while the choice of actions almost always relates to different shades of evil. The best we can hope for in such a framework is striving for the lesser evil. Returning to the game, we can say that Artus, pressured by circumstances, has no room for delay. Assuming that everything that happens falls on his shoulders and that delaying action risks rebellion in his own ranks, he chooses what he sees as the lesser evil to avoid being a victim of events and instead become their creator. This is also a consequence of the double-edged nature of the governance system, where the individual stands at the center. As success will undeservedly be attributed to that individual, the same goes with blame. However, his pseudo-religious or ideological worldview combined with the fact that he represents authority allows Artus to propose and then, when he takes command, to make snap decisions. We can say that he focuses on the outcome, even if it involves a massacre, which allows him to create events, but due to the nature of his decisions, leads to the loss of his humaneness. It's not hard to find arguments supporting the thesis that Artus is taking a step that seems reasonable at the moment. First, it is obvious that the plague is present. Second, everyone has witnessed the speed at which it spreads. Third, all they know about it is that it's magical in nature. Fourth, the capacities they have are not sufficient to quarantine and isolate the city. And five, even if they succeed in that effort, the danger of violating the quarantine is enormous. Determined in his intent, especially since he previously received information from Kel'Thuzad that Mal'Ganis, the alleged leader of the Scourge, is in the city, Artus takes action. At this point, it is worth pausing for a moment. One of the more common questions on forums discussing this topic is whether Artus decided to act before or after learning that Mal'Ganis was indeed in the city. While it can be said that this question is of minor importance for the broader narrative, addressing it might provide additional arguments supporting the previously stated ideas. The information the prince has is what Kel'Thuzad gives him, but when he appears at the gates of Stratholme and decides to exterminate the local population, there is no clear evidence that this is true. The problem arises because Mal'Ganis' appearance in the game is timed to occur a few minutes after the mission begins. So if the player hasn't directed his troops towards the inhabitants by that time, he might get the impression that Artus starts the massacre to stop Mal'Ganis from transforming the infected population into his army. However, besides the fact that in the scenes before the mission starts it is clearly shown that he makes the decision without any proof of Mal'Ganis' presence, the book by Christie Golden completely removes this doubt. Thus, we get scenes of the massacre before Mal'Ganis appears, and the reflection on the emotion similar to happiness that Artus felt when he met the Dreadlord, clearly indicating both that he was gambling when making his decision and that he had a completely twisted focus, as it is hard to understand how someone can feel any relief, let alone happiness, in such a moment. Even though his conjecture turned out to be correct in the first step, his understanding of the plague's source and the true leader of the scourge was absolutely wrong. Let's return to Kissinger to shed more light on Uther's character. To deal with problems of such ambiguity presupposes above all a moral act, a willingness to run risks on partial knowledge and for a less than perfect application of one's principles. The insistence on absolutes is a prescription for inaction. Thus, we can assume that, unlike Artes, Uther, unburdened by the previously described weight of decision-making, focuses on the method, making him incapable of any action in a situation where there is no correct approach, but allowing him to retain his humanity. By deciding to do nothing, the experienced paladin partially washes his hands, convinced that refusing command and choosing the lesser evil leaves his soul untainted. However, consider the following. Not only does he refuse to be a part of the massacre, but he does not try to stop Artes either. Possibly not wanting to worsen the situation by inciting rebellion in the army and a potential civil war, Uther turns his back and leaves with a part of his knights, letting events unfold without his influence. In this regard, his end is symbolically perfectly framed when events, in the form of the fallen prince, catch him completely unprepared during the funeral procession for King Terenas Menethil II. Trapped in old patterns, Uther disappears along with the kingdom and the light he served, killed by the hand of the student he partially raised. And finally we come to Jaina. Given everything previously said about her, we can categorize her as a proactive character like Artes. However, considering she is an actor striving to uncover the truth, and given her more comfortable position compared to the Crown Prince in terms of the necessity for swift decision-making, her actions show that the problem of conjecture cannot be reduced to making or not making a decision, but must take into account its morality, the moment it is made, the type of decision, etc. Creating events instead of being their slave certainly, but not at the cost of humanity. She focuses on both the goal and the method. A new look at the rationale behind the decision to massacre the inhabitants of Stratholme can depict Jaina's position more clearly. Viewed a bit more broadly, the previously stated logic behind the decision to kill the inhabitants of Stratholme can be categorized as follows, which Jaina does in the literary treatment of the theme. First, what about the people who did not eat products made from tainted grain? Second, how can they know what the lethal dose is and measure who took how much? Third, how can they fight the disease if they kill everyone whose treatment would provide valuable insights into the plague's nature? Fourth, can someone be judged based on what they might do in the future, that is, before they take the problematic action, or, in our case, before they transform into a monster? Therefore, Jaina takes no action at the gates of Stratholme, either for or against Artes. However, returning to the burning city after the massacre, initially unable to accept that such suffering could have been caused by her beloved, she decides to inform Uther where the prince was headed. In doing so, the sorceress metaphorically removes the veil of bias from her own eyes, resulting in the appearance of the prophet, who reveals himself directly to her in the same scene as a physical manifestation of the unknown, bearing a message that the king, the wizard, and the prince previously refused to accept, but which she had intuited, symbolically represented through clumsy espionage. Jaina undergoes what could be called a post-traumatic growth, becoming the axis around which the remnants of humanity gather. Unfortunately, her role is not further elaborated. However, it is worth emphasizing that, unlike other actors exposed to the unknown due to their position in the structure, the sorceress recognized the significance of the unknown through her own actions. Even though she represents an aspect of the academic field, her position in it, unlike Antonidas's in the same or Terenas's and Artes's in the political field, is not guaranteed. Thus, position in the structure is secondary, though not unimportant. The problem of conjecture is, in fact, unimaginably complex. After all, it is only by utilizing the benefits of hindsight that we can judge decisions made under the pressure of time, which must temper our overly harsh judgments. Nevertheless, the unfolding of events undeniably confirms Jaina's approach as the only correct one. An additional question we can raise at this point is how different sources of motivation shape the outcome, even though the goal is ostensibly the same. Focusing on Mal'Ganis might seem rational, as removing the leader could lead to the collapse of the enemy's forces. However, the question we need to ask is, what is the true motivation behind this? It is undeniable that Arthas as a character changes over the course of the campaign, even though he remains determined to eliminate the Dreadlord. On the other hand, looking from a Hegelian framework, we can view the prince as a world historical figure, which leads us to also accept the idea that the goal is self-elevation and not what is described by the grand words justifying his actions. This is crucial for understanding Arthas' trajectory, because it is with the narrative of protecting the people that the prince embarks on his righteous journey. But at the very end of the campaign, we encounter a statement that reveals the essence which could only be intuited up until that point. Responding to Muradin Bronzebeard's call not to take the Frostmourne and to lead the people back to Lordaeron, the prince sharply replies,
"Damn the men! Nothing shall prevent me from having my revenge, old friend. Not even you."
Thus, we can conclude that it is not true love for his subjects that drives him forward, but hatred for Mal'Ganis. Concern for the populace is merely a mask for bitterness, aggression, and hatred, fueled by defeats, with the idealistic story serving as a mechanism for rationalizing personal vengeance. It is a fundamentally different set of motivations which inevitably produces different outcomes. For in such an order, when driven by hatred for the enemy and the desire for revenge, as opposed to a genuine need to help his own people, the people become a means like chess pieces to achieving the goals. We can freely say that he is focusing on the wrong thing, which is nothing new. On the contrary, we already mentioned it in the segment on Stratholme. Recall that the prince in the literary adaptation of the theme felt something akin to happiness when, during the massacre of the population, he realized that Mal'Ganis was indeed there. That scene essentially foreshadows what we are talking about. Based on this, we begin to conclude that the population, in the prince's vision, is essentially a resource in his fight against the Dreadlord. If it cannot be controlled, it will be exterminated so that it does not serve the enemy. Therefore, it is clear that pride, ambition, aggression, and hatred drive the prince toward his goal, not the love for anything. Let us not forget that he is not only a prince, but also a paladin in the service of the Holy Light. From his actions, we see what it means to combine strong beliefs stemming from the teachings of the order he belongs to with negative motivation. Of course, it was said at the beginning that because of these beliefs, in any case, he would not have left Lordaeron and saved the remnants of the people. However, it is to be assumed that a different set of motivations, those stemming from love, would not have resulted in the massacre of his own population, although it would have resulted in the fall of the kingdom. Here it shows that the author seriously grappled with doubts and insights found also in Orwell's The Road to Vigan Pier, where he states that even if the theoretical book-trained socialist is not a working man himself, it is often assumed that he is motivated by a love for the working class and the desire to fight on their behalf. However, Orwell questions this assumption, observing that the intellectual, with his scholarly appearance and reliance on Marxian quotes, often seems disconnected from the working class. He suggests that the real motive for many socialists is not compassion but rather a heightened sense of order. They are more offended by the untidiness of the current system than by the misery it causes or the lack of freedom it imposes. For them, revolution is not about mass movements but about implementing reforms from above, imposed by the clever upon the lower orders. Now comes the crucial part. While these socialists might not show much love for the exploited, they do exhibit a theoretical hatred for the exploiters, engaging in the long-standing practice of denouncing the bourgeoisie. It is justified to ask how an individual who represents the union of the clerical and noble estates, and is also the heir to the throne, can truly be interested in the well-being of the people. We can assume that in the Warcraft universe, the people refers to the citizenry and peasantry in the medieval sense, that is, to the third and fourth estates, although these two groups are sometimes treated as parts of the same third estate. This then leads us to the following question. Is not the prince, with the exception of the king himself, the one most separated from them and their living conditions? The easiest thing for us is to accept that what could be the driving force in him is his concern for the kingdom, for his own domain and power, which means order and privileges. After all, we see that Arthas sacrifices his people, kills his subjects and his father, but returns for the crown, insisting even in communication with Kel'Thuzad as his closest associate that he must be addressed with the title of king. Therefore, the motivation we spoke of earlier is not surprising. The prince seeks to eliminate the threat to the state, then commits regicide and thereby patricide, and concentrates the power in his own hands. After taking the lead of the scourge, he symbolically closes the circle by reducing his people to statistics, that is, to pawns in the fight to achieve his own goals and satisfy personal ambitions. The prince becomes the king when he takes command of the mindless mass of the undead. The kingdom, with its institutions, population and territory, is thus a tool in the service of Arthas's will, instead of him being the anointed protector and servant of the kingdom. That is why, in the opening scene of the human campaign, we saw the king sitting in the palace within a lively city surrounded by other representatives of the alliance, participating in discussions and listening to the arguments of others. He is a part of a complex network of actors who have their concerns, agendas, and consciousness, and regardless of his age, he does not shy away from undoubtedly exhausting activity because he knows what it means to be the king. In contrast, in the final cinematic, Arthas kills his weary father in an empty hall, and in the last film of the entire game, he becomes the Lich King in an ice-bound tower surrounded by whiteness and winter. He undoubtedly succeeds in his intentions, but the ultimate result of actions driven by hatred can only be desolation. If we were to expand on the statements about the three main themes mentioned at the beginning, we would arrive at the following. First, Arthas is a paladin. The idealistic worldview of a paladin represents the foundation of fanaticism stemming from faith in pure categories. But those accustomed to the truth have difficulty navigating conditions that dramatically deviate from those in which the truth was formed. Second, Arthas is authority. The necessity of action by the bearer of power places the prince in a more difficult position than other actors. Yet, in addition to the fact that he bases his decisions on partial information and that he often makes them abruptly, his actions produce consequences that diverge from intentions and frequently seem to go against the historical flow. Third, Arthas forms his personality as a member of the ruling class. The motivation fueling the prince's actions leads him down the path of evil because focusing on Mal'Ganis means he will do whatever it takes to harm him, even by removing potential resources, that is, his compatriots, with whom, due to the class division, he cannot truly empathize. And it is precisely because of all of this that the closing scene of the human campaign is unforgettable. At the very end, we witness a shadow play, seeing the patricide only as a reflection on the walls of the royal palace, where Arthas, the king, and Frostmourne merge into one continuum. Everything that self dislikes, ignores, or refuses to admit it does, symbolically represented by the shadow, puts an end to the kingdom of Lordaeron. This also symbolically represents the idea that the essential actors in this scene are not the majestic figures of King Terenas or Prince Arthas we met at the beginning before the emerging chaos wounded them. Their shadows are the dark residue of a lost battle, a reflection of chaos' distorted potential and helpless tradition. Although Arthas' return is initially celebrated with fanfares, bells, flowers, and a parade, we practically witness the twilight of the kingdom, offering the masses a cheap manifestation of supposed strength like makeup on a worn-out face. Therefore, at no moment do we have a frontal view of the king as a physical manifestation of the state, unlike the opening credits of the human campaign. The scenes are framed so that we either see him from a bird's eye view or from behind. Even though we hear his voice deep and firm, such positioning prevents us from establishing whether the vocal strength is built on a solid foundations, although we notice he is an old man. Yet, a reflection on this video would be incomplete without one of the most poignant scenes, which best testifies to the depth of the fall. Walking through the city streets, Arthas is showered with rose petals, receiving ovations from the enthusiastic population. The music reaches its peak only for the choir of men to quiet down, transforming into the lowered and the sad singing of a female voice. Arthas pauses, extends his hand and catches a petal. After a brief glance at it, the prince throws the flower away, directing a sinister look at the crowd, barely visible from his hood, while his pale face enhances the impression. The rose is one of the most commonly used symbols, usually associated with love. This has its roots in Greek mythology, where in the story of Aphrodite and Adonis, the tragic death of the young man in the arms of the goddess leads to the mixing of her tears and his blood into a liquid that nourishes the earth and colors the surrounding white roses. Given the intertwining of religious and mythological heritage, this flower later appears as one of the symbols of Jesus Christ, again linked to the blood soaking the earth, indicating resurrection or rebirth in both cases. It also points to love that transcends death and the limited lives of individuals, whether in a romantic relationship between two individuals or in the understanding of love present in the New Testament as the essence of divinity embodied by Christ. In those few seconds, while gently moving the petal with his fingers, we see the last spark of humanity, a small dilemma still present in him, not strong enough to divert him from the sinister path he has taken, but still alive after all the evils he has committed. That petal is Jaina, but also the rebirth of the kingdom. In the end, both end up on the pavement. For there is no resurrection without death, no redemption without sacrifice, no birth without a creative union. There is nothing more eternal than him because, as the prince himself later emphasizes,
I intend to live forever.
Thank you for watching.